All right, it's good to see some familiar faces and old friends and new friends. We'll go ahead and start the conference. Good morning. Morning. My name is Bob Eitel. I'm president and co-founder of the Defense of Freedom Institute, and it is my privilege and my co-founder Jim Blue's privilege to welcome you to the 2024 Education Law and Policy Conference. Before we begin, we think it would be proper and fitting to begin the conference by honoring those who died 23 years ago today, actually this morning, at the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and in a field near Buckstown, Pennsylvania. So would you please join me for a moment of silence? Thank you. God bless them, and may we never forget what happened on that day. I'd like to thank Gene Meyer, Dean Reuter, and the Federalist Society for their agreement to co-sponsor and organize this conference. We greatly appreciate their partnership in this endeavor and their recognition of the importance of education law and policy as a field of interest for its members and the public. For this, I am personally grateful, and I hope this is a relationship that will continue. Today's conference marks our third Education Law and Policy Conference. In 2022, we asked the question, which was our first conference, what role for the federal government in education? Last year, we focused on the teacher unions and their impact on America's students and schools. This year's conference explores whether there is the notion or explores the question of a new civil rights movement in education. Disagreements have always existed between the right and the left over issues of civil rights. This is nothing new. But what I would argue is new is that these disagreements over civil rights issues have become clashes over fundamental social and cultural values and principles, not simply policy disagreements or contested litigation over fine points of law. I would also argue that this conflict over values has arisen from a shift in thinking that has occurred on the left about these issues, particularly sex, race, and speech, that has prompted a vigorous counter-response from conservatives, classical liberals, and many old school liberals themselves. One of these shifts in thinking on the left that has occurred has come to us in the guise of gender theory, which rejects any binding relationship between sexual biology and gender. In gender theory, the biological reality of sex and gender, which an individual's expression of being male or female, are social constructs. Because female and male are performed, a man could be a woman through an exercise of self-identification and in many instances, physical reconstruction of the body and vice versa. As we have seen in the regulatory tug-of-war between the Trump and the Biden administrations over the Title IX regulations, gender theory has powerful implications to civil rights laws, like Title IX, that were premised on a common, undisputed social and cultural legal understanding of what a man or a woman is. What is especially interesting to note on the Title IX issue is what occurred in the prior administration. Under Betsy DeVos, the U.S. Department of Education published regulations under Title IX that, for the first time in history, prohibited sexual harassment in education and mandated due process protections in institutional Title IX investigations and disciplinary proceedings. I would argue that that was the first time that a Republican administration wielded federal rulemaking power, that is federal executive power, on a major civil rights matter in aid of conservative, even classical liberal principles. And I don't think it'll be the last. It is highly likely that a second Trump administration will not only restore the due process protections of the 2020 regs being upset by the Biden administration currently, but also return to the promise of Title IX and prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex with an understanding that sex, for purposes of Title IX, is binary and biological, male and female. The other shift in thinking that occurred on the left is in regards to race, and became prominent as a result of the death of George Floyd and the BLM riots and protests. This is the idea that laws prohibiting racial discrimination are insufficient to address and stop racial disparities arising from discrimination, because those disparities are always and inevitably the result of systemic racial discrimination. With this view, it's not enough to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race. In fact, you must discriminate on the basis of race in order to correct present-day racial disparities that have inevitably arisen from acts of past racial discrimination. That is to say, it is not enough to be non-discriminatory. You must be an anti-racist, which demands discrimination on the basis of race. Legal conservatives and others have aggressively pushed back on this idea, arguing that the view flies in the face of a proper understanding of Title VI and Title VII, as well as the Equal Protection Clause. Unlike Title IX, the right has historically not used federal power or rulemaking, federal executive power or rulemaking under Title VI to address these issues, but instead used the courts to attack racially discriminatory conduct by schools. Students of fair admissions is a stellar example of this. There's another shift in thinking that has occurred, and that relates to restrictions on speech in colleges and universities and the tolerance that has been shown by institutions of higher education, particularly elite institutions of higher education, for speech restrictions. For decades, the academic left could be counted on to be at the forefront of First Amendment rights, academic freedom, and free speech on campus. I remember when I was a law student, that was very much the case. Those days are long gone. Today, there is an increasing embrace of speech for me, but not for thee, with those having the correct views on race, gender, Israel, Palestine, feminine products in men's restrooms, and the like, receiving wide berth, and those going against the campus grain being pushed out of campus discussion and debate, if not right, exclusion or expulsion. I look forward to my friend Ilya Shapiro discussing his own personal experience in this regard in a few moments. The result of all this currents is that public schools, colleges, and universities have become a battleground for disagreements, a fundamental clash of conflicts arising from race, sex, and speech. But here we see another dynamic developing, and that is parents becoming alarmed about what is happening in their public schools. And so we have come to see, and it should be no surprise to anyone in the aftermath of COVID and the learning loss that has followed, that a parental rights movement has arisen and taken root. Nearly 100 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States held that parental rights are a fundamental right. If during the next few decades the court has refused to review federal circuit cases that weaken those rights, states, through legislatures, state courts, and local school boards, appear to be making moves to buttress parental rights in education. And we saw just in the last year, the U.S. House of Representatives passing legislation enshrining federal parental rights into federal law for the first time as a condition of federal funding for public schools. Although the long-term impact and contours of the parental rights movement remain to be seen, there are indications that it is here to stay and will continue to make its presence felt in the courts, Congress, and the states. So the long and short of all this is that these developments have resulted, in my view, in an affirmative, muscular civil rights agenda coming from the right that was, frankly, in my opinion, unimaginable a generation ago. This agenda, which may be deemed a new civil rights movement in education, is characterized by a commitment to unfettered debate in higher education and due process on campus, by an understanding that sex, for purposes of Title IX is binary and biological, male and female, and with a further understanding that this binary biological classification allows for, if not requires, sex-separated spaces in athletics, housing, and intimate facilities. It's also characterized by a colorblind approach to race, and finally by a robust embrace of parents and the role that they are entitled to play in connection with the education of their children in public schools. So let's get started. First up is an armchair conversation on the state of civil rights on campus, featuring Ilya Shapiro and Charles C.W. Cook, discussing the trend toward illiberalism and intolerance in higher education, what this means for the future of the legal profession, and the molding of the country's future leaders. Charles is senior writer at the National Review, host of the Charles C.W. Cook podcast, and author of the Conservatarian Manifesto. He is also a self-described golf cart artist, and I expect him to work that into his discussion somehow today, because I have absolutely no idea what that means, but it is on his website. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, where he earned a degree in modern history and politics. He moved to the United States in 2011, became an American citizen in 2018, one hopes he does not regret that decision, and lives with his family in a sunny southern state that never had to wear masks during COVID. Ilya Shapiro is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute, a prolific brief writer. I think you're up to 500 briefs now, Ilya. Amicus briefs, I should say. Previously, he was executive director and senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, and before that, vice president at the Cato Institute. He is the author of a number of books, including his latest, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites, which is forthcoming in early 2025, in which he will be pleased to tell you often is available for pre-order on Amazon.com. I would also note that Ilya, too, is a naturalized American citizen from Canada. So I would ask these two new Americans to come to the stage now and talk to us about what is happening on American colleges and universities.